Good morning. We're going to get this thing going. I love technology, guys. Everything works with the technology. We rely so heavily on that. We got a good crowd this year, and quite a few new faces and names to see. We're thankful for that. This is our 18th annual Cotton Belt Regional Railroad Symposium. Not just about Cotton Belt, about all the railroads that serve the geographical region known as the Cotton Belt. We got I think a fantastic program for you this year. If you've been here before, you know we have outstanding presentations and the level of research that goes into these will just blow your mind. And the folks that we have today have done a tremendous amount of research and put a lot of work into discovering the information that they're going to share with you today. Thankful for that. We'll have some more announcements later. We're a little behind getting started, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our first speaker here, and we'll get rolling and we'll talk throughout the day. Obviously, we're going to be just a little bit off schedule, but make adjustments as we go. All right. First speaker has been here a few times. It's going to be on a couple of times today, but got a really interesting topic here to start out with. And welcome to the podium, Dennis Hogan.
All right, thank you very much. It's good to be back here again. I want to thank Jason once again for hosting this event, and also to the university and to all the sponsors that make this possible. So, thank you all. Today we're going to take a look at something you may have heard about, but there are probably very few people that know a lot about this topic. It's a very obscure topic. The only topic I can think of that's more obscure than this one is the San Antonio and Aransas Pass in Wallace, Texas. So when I first embarked on researching this topic, I wasn't quite sure I could dig up enough material to make a worthwhile program about it. But as time went on, I was able to dig up more and more, and I think I have a decent amount of material to educate y'all on this little rail line that existed in the early 20th century, called a Naliva-Mejia cutoff. All right, first things first. How do you say that first name? I give one version of the pronunciation. I'll tell you how it's not pronounced. It's not novella. Okay, that pronunciation and that spelling is incorrect, but you actually find it in at least one official Southern Pacific timetable I've come across. So even the railroad got it wrong at some point. It's either Neliva or Neliva, okay? One or the other. I've had nobody tell me exactly what's the more correct pronunciation. So I'll go back and forth between those two pronunciations, Neliva or Neliva. I guess I should ask the people that actually live in the little town or community sometime how they pronounce it. The name itself, it comes from the daughters of two Houston and Texas Central employees. There was Nellie and there was Eva, so you combine the two and you get the name, okay? And if you want to play it safe, the best way to refer to this stretch of railroad is just call it the Mejia Cutoff. And there's no, unless you get a Mejia, you call it Mexia, which is a lot of people do. Yeah, so yeah, it's not the Mexican cutoff. All right, so we got a little map here that shows the location. Let's see if I can get the pointer here. All right. So starting up here in the north, Corsicana, you come down this way to Mejia, Prospect, Fremont, and so forth. That's the main line of the Houston and Texas Central. On down to Houston. This line over here is the line that we're interested in. This is the Mejia cutoff. So, in short, what it was an airline route, which means a straighter route than the main line. And it was built by the Houston Texas Central between 1905 and 1906. And it was built to reduce the grade that the Houston and Texas Central had to traverse, and also it reduced the mileage a little bit. Okay, a little bit of prehistory before we delve into the cutoff itself. So the Houston and Texas Central started out originally in 1848. That's when it was chartered as the Galveston and Red River Railway. And it actually started construction in 1852 and to 1856. Built from Houston up to Cypress City, or Cypress as it's called today. In 1856, the charter was amended to the more familiar Houston Texas Central Railway. Now, like so many railroads in Texas, over the course of time, it goes back and forth between railway and railroad. I think it was 1890 or thereabouts that the railroad was renamed the Houston Texas Central Railroad. Okay. So, 1860, it had reached the town of Milliken, and there it stopped during the Civil War. Okay, oftentimes you'll see the Houston and Texas Central referred to as either Texas Central or just as the Central. Okay. It resumed construction after the Civil War in 1867 and built up toward Bryan, and followed by Hearn in 1868. Now, a little side note here. 1867, there was a widespread epidemic of yellow fever. And that happened quite a bit over the course of time in Texas and Louisiana and some of the southern states. So no doubt that epidemic had some effect on the construction of the railroad. Probably slowed it down, made finding workers a little bit more difficult than ordinary. And that epidemic was from Galveston basically up to Milliken along the Gulf Coast. All right, so continuing on, the Fremont was reached in 1870, and then Corsicana in 1871. Now, up to this point, the Houston and Texas Central was a broad gauge railroad, okay, like a few other railroads in the state of Texas. Sometimes it's called the Texas gauge or the Southern gauge. And then after Corsicana, the construction proceeded north to Ennis and Dallas. Dallas was reached in 1872, but the railroad line was north of Corsicana was built in center gauge. So you have this interesting situation here where you have a broad gauge railroad from Houston to Corsicana and a standard gauge railroad from Corsicana north. All right, continue on, 1873, Houston Texas Central finally reached what was known as Red River City, which was later cut back to the town of Denison. Basically, I think the Katy and the HNTC kind of bypassed each other in that area. HNTC wanted Red River City as their terminus, and then, of course, the Katy wanted Denison to be their terminus, and they kind of bypassed each other for a few miles, and eventually the HNTC gave in and cut back their railroad to Denison. Of course, that's where they interchanged. So now you had a connection from Houston up to the Red River and then up north. It's the first, I think, north connection that the state of Texas had by rail.
That was the first connection all the way from St. Louis to the Gulf Coast.
Okay, very good. All right, so 1874, so after the year after the construction was completed, as far north as it was going to go, the Central was running 2 mainline freights and 2 passenger trains. So was the amount of traffic, at least initially. In total, the HETC would acquire 12 different component systems. You know, would subsume those into its organization over the course of time. So organization-wise, HETC in the beginning was composed of 3 divisions. You had the Southern Division from Houston to Hearne, the Northern Division from Hearne to Denison, and then I think in 1871 they had also built out to Austin. So you had a Western Division, which from Hempstead to Austin. All right. Now the issue, here we are in 1874, now the issue of the dual gauges came to a resolution. You can imagine that would be an operational headache, having to change passengers and freight at Corsicana, okay? And that would be an interesting topic on its own sometime, is to talk about the change of gauge and how it was, how it went about, and so forth. For those of you who are curious about that, want to research that on your own, if you go to Portal of Texas History, I think it's the Galveston News, has 2 newspaper articles about that change of gauge. I think, Ken, correct me on this, I think the GH&H was also gauge at one time, wasn't it? Or is that right, Gerald? I think it was. Okay. So it was the HETC, and I think at least one other Texas road, I think it was the Galveston, I'm gonna get this wrong now. Henderson to Houston? Okay, all right. Had a gauge change in their early history. All right, so the gauge change itself happened in 2 steps. In October of 1874, they changed gauge from Corsicana to Hearne, and then by 1876 they proceeded and did the rest of the main line from Hearne south to Houston. And then of course the gauge change for the Austin branch occurred even much later, in 1877. So until the last gauge change occurred, you still had it at some point on the railroad where you had dual gauges. All right, a little bit more about the organization of the railroad. Even before the Lima Cutoff was constructed, they reorganized in 1st and 2nd Division. And then by the time World War I rolled around, you had another reorganization, or at least another name for the divisions. It's the Dallas Division and the Austin Division. And then by 1927, you had most of the Texas lines of the Southern Pacific rolled under the umbrella of Texas to New Orleans, and under that umbrella you had even more divisions. You had Dallas, you had Austin Division, and at some point the 2 got combined, Dallas-Austin or Dallas and Austin, Houston Division, Victoria, San Antonio, and a few others. Okay, now back to the topic at hand. So why was the Maheta Cutoff built? So this occurred in the early 1900s under the leadership of E.H. Harriman, who had control over the Southern Pacific and Union Pacific. And most sources consider it to be a spoiler to the Rock Island's attempt to build the Gulf Coast. And the Rock Island at the time, this is the early 1900s, was under the leadership of Benjamin Youngkin. And he was a go-getter. He was trying to get his Rock Island system built somehow to the Gulf Coast. As it turns out, what transpired was that he got control of the Trinity and Brazos Valley, which was also building at the same time. But of course, you can imagine Southern Pacific or Houston and Texas Central was worried about this competitor that was moving in on this territory. Now, there's also some speculation that there might have been another reason for the building of the Mahia Cutoff. And it's mentioned in a few sources. It goes as follows. Union Pacific was interested in connecting its line in Kansas to the Gulf Coast, and it was going to do this by means of acquiring the MOG, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Gulf, later the KOG, and then use the Houston and Texas Central down to where the Mahia Cutoff began, and that was going to be a bypass or an alternate route to the Gulf Coast. Okay. Perhaps true, maybe not. It's really needs some more research to establish if that in fact was in E.A. Chairman's mind at the time. Okay, so we said it had the Mahia Cutoff had lower grades and straighter track, and it was only 15 miles shorter than the existing main line of the Houston Texas Central. So in total length, the Mahia Cutoff was 94 miles. Okay. The construction started in 1905, ended in December of 1906. Some sources say 1907, but it was really end of 1906, close enough. This picture here is a construction train on the Mahia Cutoff. I bet I bought this postcard 40 years ago. Didn't really appreciate the scene, what was being depicted here. But I dug this up once I was doing my research. That steam shuttle there has, if you get close enough, has HTC on it. And of course, it's published by I don't know if it's some photographer or physicist in Jewett, Texas, which is right on the Mahia Cutoff. So, yeah, I bet that's a construction train. That's my story.
Those construction cars, the dump cars, are the same ones that SP used to build across Great Salt Lake, and then also used to fix the Colorado River flood. So they were really heavy capacity
Yeah,
dump cars.
they look like it, yeah. Okay. So to document the inaugural of the Mahia Cutoff, here's a newspaper article from the Mahia State Herald, dated December 20th, 1906. Talks about the line being opened up. Initially, they're going to run a mixed train in both directions. Gives a schedule there, and so forth. It tells you some of the towns it was going to run through. I actually found out that prior to the inaugural, I think as early as July of that year, they had already opened up the line from Mahia to Jewett. Okay. All right, so as time went on, there were some upgrades that were made with the railroad. In 1910, the Engineering News trade publication stated that the HETC had filed to upgrade at least 57 miles of the line to 75-pound rail. And the same news article mentions the proposed construction of terminal facilities in North Zolch in the way of a roundhouse. The foundation was laid, but apparently the roundhouse itself never was built. They had big plans for North Zolch. Okay, here's a list of the stations on the line as of 1922. I'm sure it's not much change from when it was opened in 1906. One thing that caught my eye was the number of spurs on the line. I count, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spurs. Oh, did, yeah. I'm gonna say something about that in a minute, about what became of the railroad after it was abandoned. So, and that'll both tie in with your comment. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people have noted that, Texas 39 is a pretty straight highway. All right, here we go. So here's a list of facilities on the railroad, on the Mahia cutoff. You have one turntable in there in Mahia Yard, Y tracks, 2 of them, Mahia Junction and Hempstead. Water stations, 1, 2, 3, 4. Fuel stations, Mahia and Hempstead. Section houses, there were 12 of those. They were spaced 8 miles apart. You know, it'd be interesting to go down there sometime and see if some of those section houses still exist, because oftentimes, you know, a private party would end up buying one of those and using it as a home. But who knows, maybe one of the section houses still exists. And of course, you had stock pins located at several locations on the line. All right, we'll take a look at some of the structures along the line. Here's the HTC depot in Mahia. There was also a freight depot as well. This is the passenger depot. Somebody told me that if you go to the library in Mahia, that they have I think he said a panoramic view of the depot and rail yard facilities in Mahia. Something I haven't checked out yet, but you have to be down there and want to kill some time, check out the library and see if that claim is correct or not. And of course, Mahia was also the northern terminus of the Trinity Brazos Valley, a competition for this, for the Mahia cutoff. You got the passenger depot in the foreground, and in the background you've got the freight depot. Of course, one of the big revenue sources in Mahia was the big oil field that was just south of town. I'm sure both railroads, Houston, Texas Central, and Trinity and Brazos Valley, both, you know, shared some of that revenue from the oil fields. Another side note here, up until early 1990s, just south of the town of Mahia, there was a 3 or 4 stall concrete roundhouse, just a frame. And it was still intact. Gone now, but at least until the 1990s, it was still there. Aerial view, okay? This is a view of Mahia. Let's see if I right in here, I think that's the passenger depot. This is the HTC freight depot. And then about a block away, somewhere in here, is the Trinity Brazos Valley depot. Might be right there. All right, got some maps here. These are kind of interesting. the U.S. Army, dated 1920. So here's Mahia here. Both railroads came south out of town. Trinity and Brazos Valley crossed over the HETC here. There was an interlocking tower. And of course, the Trinity and Brazos Valley came over to Teague. And then, oops. The HETC kept going on south to Mahia Junction, and there's the split. The main line went off in this direction, kind of the southwest, and then the Mahia cutoff came down this way in kind of the southeasterly direction. All right, Jewett. The picture postcard on the left shows Railroad Avenue in Jewett. I rather suspect this. It hadn't changed, but okay. I rather suspect this row of businesses here face the INGN, okay, rather than Houston, Texas Central. All right. But over here on the right, we have a picture, photo postcard of the HETC depot in Jewett. Okay, I'm guessing this may have been taken before the railroad was even in business. The reason I say that is there's cleared out quite a bit. There's no order boards yet. There's no sign of real activity, I think. But I'm guessing it's got to be pretty on, maybe even before trains were started operation. This, by the way, is another one of those postcards I bought 40 years ago. Well, first of all, I said, where is Jewett? Okay. I'm going to buy this anyway, and maybe someday it'll prove some value. And sure enough, it did. Yeah. And Jewett. I think this is the same postcard source of that construction train. Probably an individual or maybe a drugstore or something in Jewett that made picture postcards. All right, got more maps here. This is another Army map. So you've got the HETC coming down here. It actually, let's see. It actually came down here, a little bit west of town. That depot you saw was probably right here, west of the main, or southwest of the main business district. Then it continued on south. Here is the Trinity and Brazos Valley. It crossed here, and I'm not sure if it was at grade or grade separated. I have to do more research. Came down here and continued on south. Now, what I find interesting here is some of the spurs here. There's a beargrass spur. There's one other spur, we can find it. But anyway, as some of you probably know, there's a lot of lignite in that area. And so they were doing early lignite mining, and I'm sure the spurs were for the lignite mining. Yeah, there was a Nucor steel plant. I don't know if it's still there or has the same name or not. Okay, basically a extension of the same map as above. You've got Jewett up here. Here's the HETC. Here's the Trinity and Brazos Valley. Pretty close right here. They're almost like side by side. And then they diverge down here near Robbins. HETC is on the east side. Trinity and Brazos Valley is on the west side. Oh, I forgot to mention. International Great Northern, later the Missouri Pacific. That was really the first railroad into Jewett. Let's see if we can get this to work.
It's a video you probably have to click the viewport.
How do you do that? Ah, here we go.
Normandy, Texas. The history of Normandy must start in the year 1804 when Robert Rogers was granted a league of land, 4,428 acres, under the Mexican Colonization Act in the David G. Burnett Colony. This shows the location of the grant on an early map of Leon County. The Rogers grant was located just north of the El Camino Real, or Old Spanish Road, known to us as OSR. The El Camino Real basically followed a series of prairies from the Sabine River to San Antonio. A lot can be said about the historical significance of the El Camino Real, but it does not add to this story. The Rogers Prairie Post Office was established July 10, 1874 on the El Camino Real on the Rogers land. The town of Rock Prairie was a trade center that included a Masonic lodge, a church, a school, several stores, a physician, a blacksmith shop, and was a stage stop between Nacogdoches and San Antonio. Two railroads, the Trinity and Brazos Valley, TNBV, and the Houston and Texas Central, HTC, were built in 1905, 6, and 7 between Houston and Dallas. The railroads passed through the southwest corner of the Rogers land, but about 2 miles west of Rogers Prairie. To orient you, the Burlington Railroad now operates on the old Texas and Brazos Valley right-of-way. State Highway 39 is on the old Houston and Texas Central right-of-way. In January 1907, S.B. Phillips filed for record a plat of a new town located at the junction of the old San Antonio Road and the two new railroads. Notice the two depots, cattle pens, and cotton wharf between the tracks. The new town was laid out such that the numbered streets are parallel to the railroads. First Street is where the Star office is today. Second is by the bank, the Methodist Church, and on 4th and Main. The named avenues running perpendicular to the railroads are Holland, Batson, Rogers, Heath, Main, Hollis, Wooley, and Phillips. They were so named after outstanding citizens of the Rogers Prairie community. In 1905, 6, and 7, there was mass movement to the new town of business buildings, homes, the church and school, and on log rollers pulled by mules. The post office in Rogers Prairie closed on October 20, 1906, and a new post office opened in the new town that same day. John H. Heath was postmaster. The town was named Normandy in honor of Judge Norman G. Kittrell. This is a copy of his picture that hangs in the Central Courthouse. Many wanted to keep the name Rogers Prairie, and I understand there was dissension over the name of the new town being Normandy. The new town, however, grew rapidly, as the following pictures will show, and in 1913, residential subdivisions were added to the original plot. This shows the water well being drilled at the intersection of Main and 2nd Street, in front of the Bank of Normandy. The Bank of Normandy received State Charter number 169 on January 12, 1907, with capital of $10,000. We're looking south on 2nd Street. We will address the progress of this bank later on, because it has an interesting history. This is the earliest picture of the town available. 1909. This is Main Street looking east. The only brick building is the two-story Bank of Norman G on the right. Notice the water well and the trough are in the middle of the intersection. The people gathered on the left are in front of the post office. The post office was located there in a drugstore until 1913 or 14. The Rogers Prairie Sign Lodge number 540 met in the two-story frame building on the south side of the street until 1913 or 14. Financing was arranged by the lodge for part ownership of the two-story building on 2nd Street that later housed the post office. This picture was made before a water tower was erected beyond the Texas and Brazos Valley Depot in the background. The electrical system was direct current, provided by Norman G. Electric and Ice Company. The plant was located east of the railroad, near where Shaw's Gin was in later years. Mr. Lawrence Martin ran the power plant. In 1927, the electric system became part of Western Public Service Company and later Gulf States Utilities. The system was then converted to alternating current. This shows Monty Harris standing about where Westmoreland's grocery is today. In the background is the north side of Main Street between 2nd and 3rd Streets. This was before the hardware and T.S. Madison dry goods stores were built. The post office was in the drugstore in the center building.
Keep going. Stop, go back a little bit. See what this is.
Methodist Episcopal
Yeah,
Church
stop right
site.
there.
The Methodist.
All right, well, you've learned more about Norman G than you thought you started. Oops. All right, so here, this is the Trinity and Brazos Valley Depot with Norman G. Back here is the HTC Depot on the head of. So they're very close to each other. No, no. No, in fact, I don't think, there are no existing depots along the hay. There's barely any depots left on the SP south of Rayburn. But none on the, all right. I'm gonna go ahead and advance to the next slide. This was supposed to be just a clip of just the depot. And you relinquish control of back to. Oh, you're right. Okay, I'm back. All right, moving on south. All right, so Navasota Union Depot within next major depot on the line. Actually, it was on both the hay cutoff and the main line. This was the Union Depot, shared with Santa Fe. INGN had its own depot not too far away. Hempstead, okay? Now, in terms of operation, especially with their mixed trains and passenger trains, it would normally run between Bahia, sometimes to Navasota, but most of the time they would actually continue on to Hempstead because they had more facilities there for engine service. So even though it's on the main line, I included this presentation since it's integral to the operation of the Bahia cutoff. So here is a passenger or a train on the Austin branch, and over here is the main line. Here's another view of the Hempstead Depot. Got some of that frilly woodwork there under the roof that you would see on some of the depots along Southern Pacific. I am told that this depot exists in some form. I think it's in Round Top, Texas. May not look exactly like this, but it exists in some form. That's a big antique shopping town community. So some business down there has the Hempstead Depot. fun on the Mahia Cutoff. What would a history of a railroad be without at least one train ride? Found this while researching the newspapers. 1913, February 21st to be exact, in the Bryan Eagle. Two desperados got on train number 3 and tried to rob it. Conductor beat them back. They jumped off, were never seen again, and the train proceeded on. Now, something's not right about this report. Okay, it says it occurred about 1 a.m. Well, first of all, checking the schedules, I don't think the HETC had a night train. Okay. Oddly enough, the Trinity and Brazos Valley had a night train. Okay, that's a different railroad from what's being reported here. And if it was, in fact, the Trinity and Brazos Valley train that was robbed, time is not right. So there's a mystery here, something in the reporting that's not right. So I have to dig into this a little bit further, see if we can get some more information. But at least some kind of a train robbery occurred, or was attempted. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about traffic over the Mahia Cutoff. As I said before, this is a pretty obscure operation, pretty obscure section of railroad. Not much is written about it at all, or, and by the way, after this presentation today, you will be among the world experts on the Mahia Cutoff. The one gentleman that does say something about this is, of course, S.G. Reed, kind of the father of Texas railroad history, at least pre-1940, okay? In his book, his tome, History of Texas Railroads, he has just this following to say. The Mahia Cutoff was used almost exclusively for through, that's my emphasis here, freight and passenger trains as the local traffic was negligible. Okay, so fact check. So I did a little digging into schedules and so forth. All right, so there weren't any through trains in this line, okay? With very few exceptions. I mean, at least they don't show up in the timetables. Now, you don't expect freight trains to show up in a passenger timetable, so, okay, you're not gonna find out about freight trains in passenger timetables. So, we'll talk about passenger trains in a minute. So, if there were freight trains that ran on this line, and there were, they had to run as extras, I would say. They didn't show up in the employee timetable. Okay, traffic, freight traffic. Cotton was king. That was probably the #1 source of revenue on this segment of railroad. This passenger timetable over here shows, of course, the other agricultural products that were important to be shipped, as well as cotton. Okay. Over here is a bill of lading from Mahia, Texas. Now, this is actually predates the Mahia Cutoff, but I needed something to show here. Even though it's earlier than the cutoff existence, at least it has Mahia in it. And of course, cotton was an important product to be shipped. Yeah, 1893. So that's 14 years before the Mahia Cutoff was in operation. Okay, now, there was at least one through freight that I know of that did operate on the Mahia Cutoff. It was called the Cotton Ball. And this is in around 1926. And I know this, even though the list of stations over here doesn't mention, it mentions Mahia, but it doesn't mention any station along the cutoff itself. But the reason I know that this freight train here, this named freight train, ran on the Mahia Cutoff is I happened to meet a gentleman who worked for the HETC rather elderly gentleman when I met him. And he told me that Cotton Ball was a train that he operated, and others, of course, over the May cutoff. So. All right, little gallery of Houston, Texas Central timetables. Kind of shows how artsy some of them were, at least the first three. And of course, they predate the Mejia cutoff, so it's just there for show's sake. The last one, of course, is from 1914 or 15, Sunset Central. Okay, that would have covered the Mejia cutoff passenger operations. Sunset Central was a kind of a brand name that was developed around 1910 to 1915. It kind of covered a lot of the Southern Pacific lines in Texas. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So you'll see that on some of the documentation, timetables, advertisements, and so forth. Okay, passenger service. Most of the passenger service on Mejia cutoff was in the form of a mixed train. Mejia to Navasota, or more often Mejia to Hempstead, because of the engine facilities in Hempstead. So here are the various train numbers that I found. The 3132, 131, 132, 345, 346. The second set of numbers is the Sunday only train. Okay. And the first set of numbers is the Monday through Saturday train. Got an example of a pass over here, Jewett to Ennis. Okay, here's an actual schedule. At this time, this is 1914, trains 31 and 32 were actually a standard passenger train. They were not a mixed train. There was a brief period there where they actually operated a passenger train without the freight cars. Okay, and as I just mentioned, there was a period there, about 2 years that I found, where they actually had a regular passenger train operating on the line. But it was not a mixed train. All right, now an exception. Okay, there was at least one through passenger train that ran over the Mejia cutoff, and that was the Owl. And that was under the USRA in 1918. So it must have been kind of an experiment, I'm guessing. Didn't stop at any of the stations, the intermediate stations along the cutoff. It just went, Hempstead and Navasota, up the cutoff, or down the cutoff to Mejia, and so forth, and on to Dallas, if you're coming from Houston. And I found another exception. 1914, there was a reshuffling of passenger service. I'm not sure what the reason was. Maybe if I read the article more closely. Anyway, trains 3 and 2 ran as a Houston Mejia, and I later found out all the way to Ennis over the Mejia cutoff. So I would consider that a through train, even though it wasn't Houston to Dallas. It covered the entire length of the Mejia cutoff and then went a little bit further. There's all sorts of strange things and interesting things you find if you look at newspaper clippings from the era. As Gerald Hook will attest to. Okay, just another sidebar here over the main line is where the action was as far as traffic. Here are some of the named passenger trains that were operating on the Houston, Texas Central main line. Notice they have a Lone Star there, which is not the Cotton Belt one. Al Husker, most of y'all probably heard of those. Texas Limited, St. Louis Limited, Houston Limited, San Antonio Limited, Dallas Fort Worth Limited, Lark. Yes, there was a Texas Lark. Most people think of the more famous Lark on the West Coast, but in fact, we had our own Lark operating here in Texas, which, by the way, was a Dallas, Hearn, San Antonio train, the Lark was. So at one time, you actually had direct crew service between Dallas and San Antonio on the Southern Pacific. All right, oilfield special, and of course the Sunbeam. And I mentioned the Central Express as well. Let's see. Oh, there's no back. The Owl. The Owl is another named train that had its corresponding example on the West Coast. There was an Owl that ran as a night train between the Bay Area and LA. And of course, we had our own. That, by the way, was the last passenger train on the old Houston Texas Central. It was terminated in 1958. Okay, 1931. SP trying to pull a fast one here, trying to play with the rules here. They wanted to run one train a day over the Mahia Cutoff instead of one northbound and one southbound. They wanted to alternate. You know, one day we go northbound, the next day we go southbound. Okay, they wanted to basically it's a reduction in service. And the Attorney General of Texas said, no, you're going to run per the rules, one train each way a day. Okay, so their little ploy didn't work. All right. I don't expect you to read this because it's kind of small, but this kind of shows you some of the research that I did looking at, in this case, employee timetables. There's a source of these online that I can provide you if you're interested. The gentleman has a rather large collection of HTC and other Southern Pacific timetables. So I was perusing through these to see, you know, what were the what passenger trains were being operated and so forth, and wrote these down. Really really no surprises. It already really confirmed what I already knew. Mainly mixed trains over the Mahia Cutoff, with the exception of the Owl in 1918. Okay, was the one through passenger train. There is a 9-year gap here in the timetable collection. It's possible there may be some surprises in terms of operations, but from what I gleaned from the existing timetables, this is pretty much what I found. Okay, 1932, SP decided to abandon this for lack of traffic. And at first the state said no, and then they acquiesced in 1933, and the Mahia Cutoff was abandoned. Now, I read somewhere that a few miles outside of Mahia was kept, at least for a few years, maybe for car storage, or maybe there was some industry, maybe the Mahia oil fields or something, that required them to keep a little bit of the Mahia Cutoff. But by and large, it was abandoned, and it became, most of the right of way became Texas Farm to Market Road 39, which I'm told is a pretty straight stretch of highway. I wonder why. A little bit. I mean, it's not going to be perfect, but it's. Another Aggie friend of mine told me that he noted that it seemed to be pretty straight. That's what he. That's what I think he was going 90, but he did. Close enough. Yeah. All right. All right. Wrap it up here. This is just kind of a summary of my resources on this. Some of the stuff I have a personal collection. Professor Hook here is responsible for some of the photo editing, take a bow. The maps, the two maps were generated by my friend Steve Goen, and we have dubbed this railroad, section of railroad, the hell of a cutoff. We thought it might be more appropriate. S.G. Reed, of course, you can't publish anything about Texas railroads without at least looking at his, what he wrote about. The 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth bullet there, Southern Pacific Bulletin. SP had its own house publication just for the Texas and Louisiana lines. They had a separate one for the Pacific lines. And so S.G. Reed, between 1941 and 1946, wrote a series of articles about the Southern Pacific in Texas and Louisiana. Stuff that's not included in his book. There's a lot more information in those articles. And of course, the origin of the name Neliva or Neliva, I got from those articles. That was my source. S.G. Reed in one of these articles. And they're fascinating articles because they go into a lot more depth about particular lines and operations, traffic, and so forth. And then I also used the Burlington Bulletin number 19 about Chief Texas, the Boll Weevil, because it's relevant to the discussion of the Neliva cutoff. The next to last bulletin is where I got all those information from employee timetables. John Charles has scanned, I think, most of his timetable collection, if not a good part of it. And not only SP stuff as well, there's other contributors and other railroads mentioned. But it's a very good source of information, at least for this presentation. And then the last one here, the very first slide, it's very difficult to find pictures of the operations when they leave a cutoff. So I had to kind of ad-lib the picture of the engine number 86 was actually at Hearn, wasn't on the Neliva cutoff. But hey, you got to embellish your slide presentation somehow. So you take what you got. Okay. So that's it. Thanks very much. We're now experts on the Neliva Mahia cutoff. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Dennis, why was the engineers out there?
Good question. Okay.
Next question.
All right.
75-pound steel was put in 1910. That's the railroad, the railroad.
Probably. I doubt they did any more upgrades. I think the original Houston Texas Central was laid as 56-pound rail. And you notice it said that they were replacing the 61.5-pound rail with the 75-pound rail. So was that the original weight of rail that was put in for the Neliva cutoff? Probably, since it was much later than the original HTC.
And the reason for abandonment was lack of traffic.
Yeah, that was the usual plan, lack of traffic.
Even though it was a shorter line.
Yes, yeah. One thing I don't have in my presentation, but I occasionally would find newspaper articles that talked about such and such a train was detoured over the Mahia cutoff because of a flood or a derailment on the main line. So it was really a kind of a relief valve railroad. Probably, if anything can be claimed about its existence, it was a relief valve. Shorter, lower grades. Yeah. So, but at some point, I guess the cost of maintaining it was exceeded its usefulness. So, one other little footnote. I know you were interested in moving on here. Mahia tried to get the shops for the Trinity Brazos Valley. Of course, they failed. They went over to Teague. Later on, I think just before World War I, they tried to, I'm going to say, steal the shops from Ennis. And of course, Ennis raised a ruckus about that and won out. But Ennis, in turn, stole the shops from Corsicana. The original HTC shops were in Corsicana. Somewhere around 1890, they got moved up to Ennis. And I think part of that deal had to do with water supply. Ennis promised or actually had a good supply of water, and so the shops were moved to Ennis, and that's where they stayed until the end. Okay? The old Mahea is trying to, always trying to grab somebody else's property. All right, any other questions? Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah, I mean, newspapers back then made news out of just a little of this whole thing. Engine number 319 was in the shops for whatever, fireman so-and-so went on vacation, had a great fishing trip, just little newsy little things that you would never see in a newspaper today, if you can find a newspaper. All right, any other questions? If you think something later on, just let me know. Thank you, Jason.
We'll try to move on along here a bit and get to the next station. If we're running about to keep them scheduled about like Amtrak, I think we might be a little better even. See what our own time record is. All right. I was really excited to find our next presenter to bring in a little bit broader scale of topic. We are a regional symposium and not just Cotton Belt. So, of course, all these railroads are connected to one rare form or another. But this is a topic that I think we've had a whole lot of that here. So, Ken Stavinoa is our next presenter, and I'll let him come up here and I'll load the presentation.
All right, thank you. So this presentation is based on a book that I wrote recently, The Rails Crossed at Wallace, and I do have copies for sale back at the table over there. All the proceeds benefit Eagle Lake Depot Museum. We're a 501c3 museum dedicated to railroad history in Southeast Texas. This book came about as sort of a result first of a presentation to the Gulf Coast chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. They're always looking for presentations, and so I had some data on Wallace, Texas, a little bit of data. I had a tower log book, which I'll show you some pictures from last 3 months of 1918. Showed all the railroads. There used to be a locking tower, as you can see on the right. That's the Wells Fargo building in the center. That's the 1889 Union Depot built by the SNAP on the left. But I was fortunate to have a handful of photographs from Wallace. That's about all that exists. And you drive through Wallace today, and I'll show you some pictures. And there's just pretty much the BNSF tracks, all that's left in there. So this started as a presentation, and I decided, you may know that the infamous Skip Waters, who likes to do 24 hours at Saginaw and 24 hours at, Timbuktu and such. And I thought, wouldn't it be neat if we could go back in time and do 24 hours at Tower 51 in Wallace? Of course, it's been gone since 1925, so you get to do this pretty much virtually. But since I had the Tower logbook, I had listed all the trains I went through, I just picked a date in there, and the date happened to be November the 9th, 1918, 2 days before the armistice was signed in World War I. And I analyzed the traffic, and I tried to find photographs of either the locomotive that came through or one of its sister locomotives, for both the Gulf Colorado and for the San Antonio Rapids Pass. And so I did that and gave them a presentation. They were really, really happy about that. And they said, well, would you write a little bit longer article for our newsletter? And so I got a little bit longer article for the newsletter. And I thought, there might be enough data here to do a coffee table book. Okay, so I thought, well, we do, a little coffee table book. A friend of mine had done that, and a lot of pictures, and enough text to make it interesting, and some historical revelations. But I ran into a problem that every author probably loves to have, and I ran into just so much data. I was shocked by the amount of data that I found for Little Wallace, Texas, and that's why the book kind of became, even though it's not strictly about Wallace, it's not a history of Wallace, it's called a study for a reason, because it studies these two railroads, that happened to cross in Wallace. They also crossed in Cameron, there's other places these railroads crossed, but there was a lot of data about Wallace, so it kind of became the focal point for the operation of these two railroads, and that kind of helped tie a lot of things together that would have been difficult to tie together otherwise, and so that's really how the book came about. It's a book that you don't have to read it from cover to cover. It can be used as a reference book. In fact, in the back of the book, there's 4 appendices. I tried to find every employee in Wallace I could find between 1880 and about 1930, and I listed all those in there and their affiliation with railroad, if you could find it. A lot of it I had to use census data for, and early census data wouldn't say which railroad they worked for. They would just list their occupation. So if you had an employee roster, you could cross-check that, but employee rosters are very, very difficult to come by. Another one was all of the, and I'll show you examples, all the train orders, traffic, and the messages I found from 1911 for Wallace, Texas. I described a little bit of those, but I put an index, I transcribed that took me like 2 months to transcribe every one of those. Reading all the hand scratches, it's pretty much handwritten, no typewriting, nothing like that, and so reading all the hand scratch. Some of it is kind of in pseudo cipher, trying to figure out what they're saying and put that, so I put all that in another appendix in the back, along with some other data in there. So it's kind of a useful reference book, but it talks about a lot of different articles, and even though it covers these two railroads, you don't have to be a fan of these two railroads to learn stuff about this book. I cover parts of the Great War, the flood of 1913, a lot of chapters that, you read about, but seeing their impact, the actual impact on railroads is pretty interesting. So this is Joseph Edward Wallace, and the only thing I'm going to read from the book is his little bio. I just put a small one at the beginning. He was born in Morgan County, Alabama, to Joseph C. and Elizabeth Crockett Wallace, in April 30th, 1835. His father could trace lineage directly to Sir William Wallace, spelled W-A-L-L-A-C-E, good Scotchman, right? In Scotland. The family immigrated to America and settled in the Carolinas, where one branch of the family changed the spelling of the name to what you see up there. His mother, Elizabeth, was of the same family as Davy Crockett. Joseph's family moved to Chapel Hill, Texas in 1848. Joseph was 15 when he spent the year 1850 merchandising in Chapel Hill before attending Chapel Hill Male College in 1851 and part of 1852. He resumed his mercantile business and served as Chapel Hill postmaster for the next few years. He married Sarah Landis in Washington County on February 12, 1860. Joseph, along with his brother John C. and brother-in-law Henry Landis, formed the firm Wallace, Landis and Company in 1865 in Galveston, the city where Joseph would reside for most of his life. He was very active in civic affairs in Galveston and served as a board member in both civic and commercial organizations. He was director of the Gulf Colorado and Santa Fe from 1877 to 1886, when the railroad was sold to the Addison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. He also served as vice president of the Galveston and Western Railroad Company and was a stockholder in many of the large enterprises in Galveston. Joseph and Sarah had 8 children, 5 of whom survived to adulthood, and his son, Charles Landis Wallace, joined the Wallace, Landis and Company in 1882. His wife preceded him in death, and Joseph Edmund Wallace died at the home of his daughter, Pearl Wallace Knox, in Houston on October 4th, 1907. And that solved one of the great mysteries, because I always wondered why the little library in Wallace, Texas is named the Knox Memorial Library. And that was because his daughter's married name was Knox. So the Gulf Colorado service to Wallace began, it started in Galveston, built west toward Richmond. They had to pause because building the bridge across the Brazos River near Thompson's, Texas, became troublesome. The first bridge washed away. It had flooded about the same time. So by the time they've reached Richmond, the GCNS is out of money, and there's a kind of a squabble internally amongst the board of directors about what should happen. As it turned out, George Seeley and his brother John and several directors kind of came to the rescue and bought the company from the existing board of directors and kind of shoved some of the county people out of the way who they felt were obstructing the construction of the railroad. And so this is where Joseph and people get on board and push the railroad further. What you notice about this service to Wallace is that this is Monday, December 22nd, 1879, and when I first found this ad, I was excited because this tells us when the run to Rosenberg opened. Okay, that's really what it's all about. But you look at the very bottom, it says freight to or from Wallace, so you can't ride on a train to Wallace, or at least not on a passenger train, but you can ship freight there. And notice at the very bottom it says in parentheses, Old Bovine Bend. And that was the name of a community about 2 miles northeast of Wallace, closer to the Brazos River. And it was called Bovine Bend because kind of a U shape in the Brazos River meant it was a good place you could kind of pen cattle up in there because you had the river surrounding it on 3 sides. Bovine Bend actually had a post office, in the early 1870s. But of course, when Wallace was found, they formed a new post office. But this is the very earliest of the timetables I could find that actually showed, any service to Wallace. And so by January of 1880, they have passenger service and via mixed train to Wallace. And then, of course, they go on to Sealy on the Temple, and the GC keeps going. So I know you can't read much of this. This is actually a 1890 GCNSF map, and it does show the town of Wallace was actually platted. Sealy actually had a county engineer plat the town and put the GCNSF service in there, including in there was a depot which they built probably by about 1880. The depot was up. They had some stock pens. They had what's called an oil house, and this is not for oil. They were using coal at the time. This is for lubricating oils. They actually wrote that in there to lubricate the locomotive. And they had scales, and they had all sorts of whatnot that you would need for a train. And the depot was a standard Gulf Colorado board and batten passenger depot. I describe in the book from some of the experiences what it was like. So of course this is 1880. There's no town in Wallace. There's no running water. So of course they have a cistern, and they capture water from the gutters. Okay. If you are in a drought situation, your local train, which comes every day, can bring you water or ice or something else. So at least the depot would have water. Of course, there's no air conditioning, or like my dad used to say, it's cold in the winter and hot in the summer. Okay, doors are open, windows are open, flies and gnats and mosquitoes can come in. In the winter, you have a coal stove, no insulation. So next to the stove, within about 5 feet, it's probably reasonably warm for the we have in South Texas, but not much. But with the coal stove inside and the steam locomotives burning coal outside, there's coal dust pretty much everywhere. And there were rules for the station agents. They were supposed to try to, every week at least, try to get some of this coal dust, out from the walls and the floors and everything else, but not during open hours, because they don't want everybody breathing in that. So who knows how often they really followed those instructions. There's a lot of interesting early instructions on what the station agents were supposed to do, so I described some of that. Fortunately, a couple years later, by 1889, there's a water tank in Wallace for the Gulf Colorado. So they have a source of water, they have a pump house, they have a source of water there. and they no longer have to rely on the cistern, you know, for any water. No electric lights, of course, kerosene lamps for any, you know, for any lighting. And that was life. Another thing people, I tend to forget this a lot, there is no fencing for livestock. Livestock roams freely, goats, chickens, cattle, horses, everything. And so station agents were warned to make sure that these, you know, domesticated animals did not eat feed or seed or anything else that was at the depot. And so you start seeing, by about the 1890s, the railroads start fencing off a lot of their right-of-way property to keep people's cows and chickens and pigs and everything away from the depot property. So a lot of things, like I said, we kind of forget about. I relearned when writing this book about what life was like, you know, pretty much before 1900. So here's an early SANAP map. You notice they've got you know, the line to Kerrville. They've made it as far as West Point on going to Waco. They have not gotten to Houston yet. They're actually, Wallace is kind of the point where the line diverges, and they show a line straight down to Galveston. But of course, they don't own that line to Galveston, but they have an agreement with, guess who, the Gulf Colorado and Santa Fe, to provide service to Galveston, chair car service and freight service. When they were building through Wallace, they built through in 1887, back June 28th is the date that they actually reached Wallace. But they weren't really, that part of the terrain from Wallace east to Houston was very, very low, and they had to build a lot of trestles and a lot of bridge work and such. And plus they had floods and they had a railroad strike, and so it took them a long time, a lot longer to finish that last few miles between like Wallace and Houston than it did like from Wallace west to Yoga. So interesting early map for the company that shows kind of what their plans were. This map doesn't show it, but there's another map that shows that they were planning to go to Logansport, Louisiana, and so they were going to come a lot further north. That didn't materialize. You can see that they had planned to extend it beyond Kerrville up north, I think to Mason or somewhere. They were actually trying to reach New Mexico. Of course, that never happened either. But interesting early map that shows some of what the SNDP was planning to do. But of course, Wallace decided to have a second, you know, railroad in town. It's always good when you have competition for rates and serves a different part of the country. So as a town, this made Wallace, you know, very important. They were crossroads now. At this time when they built through, of course, the Texas law was just railroads have to stop at these crossings and make sure, you know, trains aren't coming. There's no interlocking towers or anything before about 1901. You know, the Texas legislature hasn't passed any rules about that. So it's pretty much, you know, any time you're a railroad and you approach a crossing, you're just going to stop, you know, and hopefully there's no other train coming. And typically the earlier railroad, if there's a contention, the railroad that was there first tends to have both the right of way, but safety rules were supposed to apply. So basically you had to make sure that the coast was clear before you proceed across the track. One of the things SNAP built was that joint passenger depot that I showed you in the other picture, kind of an unusual shape. This is of all the structures in Wallace, this building actually still survives today, believe it or not. It's the oldest building probably in Wallace, Texas. It was used as a section house after it was retired. 1923, the Gulf Colorado built their own joint depot and replaced this one. It's used as a section house and all sorts of things for years and years, and it's been moved about a mile and a half outside of town. And most people that see it don't really know, because it doesn't look quite like it did in the photograph, you know, earlier. But it's amazing of all the buildings that were in town, that's the one. This is the one that survives. But they manned this depot and they provided. I'm sure there wasn't, unless there was a convention or something. Probably wasn't a lot of passenger traffic in Wallace. That depot's, you know, provided that. So you'd have a cashier there and maybe a porter to tend to baggage or anything. The express business, while both railroads handled express business, at first Gulf Colorado used the Texas Express Company. They were eventually bought out by Wells Fargo. The SNAP used the Pacific Express Company, which again, they were also bought out by Wells Fargo. So you have both of the freight depots providing the express business up until 1906 when Wallace built that Wells Fargo building I showed you in the very first photograph there. And Wells Fargo themselves staffed that building and they took that job away from the station agents. But express business was important because really before 1904, the post office didn't handle parcels. And the parcel service they did have was very, very expensive and most people wouldn't use it. And so your express companies provided that business. If you wanted to send something insured, you couldn't do that via the post office. You wanted to send a money order, couldn't do that via the postal service. You had to use an express company. And that's why Wells Fargo's and its predecessors were really, really important, because things that the railroad didn't want to handle, like live chickens or cows or something, a lot of people would ship via an express company, you know, if they could, because the chance of your livestock getting to market in better shape where it was more, you're gonna pay more for the service, but they had tend to love the care. For a while, the Santa Fe basically said, there was a creamery in Wallace, and they said, all your creamery's gonna be shipped to the express company, because we don't wanna mess with that cream, because, it's gonna tend to sour, on our trains, where the express company's gonna take better care of it, so, this is the, 1904 drawing from, I got this from the DeGolyer Library, and I'm sorry, the resolution's not really good, but that's basically the track layout for Wallace, Texas, at the time they're going to build, Tower 51. And so, from the upper left down to the bottom right is the Santa Fe, and upper left is towards Sealy, going northward, and down to the right is towards Galveston, going southward. And then the S&AP crosses it, and up and to the right is westbound, and down to the left is eastbound. And so, they drew this, and they came up with about a 20 function, they decided they needed 20 levers to do all the functions. The two connecting tracks are both S&AP, and in the early days, that was also used as a Y before the line was completed to Houston. Any S&AP train was going to have to turn around here, or else back. If it was going further east, you'd have to back up to Wallace. This is the first Y on the system, and then turn around to go back towards Yoakum. But in the later days, this was basically just where they would switch and then hand off freight to each other. They would leave passenger and freight cars out there, and they would send a note to the other, the other train dispatcher, basically saying, "I've got these cars on this line for you." And so the interlocking tower was went into service in 1904, very similar to one that was in Rosenberg, just 15 miles away, that went into service about a year and a half earlier. And so it had an interlocking machine, it had signals. This is a very simple interlocking plant. There's only one crossing of the railroads, and only one part of these transfer tracks were considered inside the interlocking, so they didn't have a lot of signals, and everything was out of the scope of that. So this is a very easy plant. Pretty much all there was, the levers were for what are called derails, which would literally derail a train, and those were required by law to put on the track. So if you tried to run the red signal, as an engineer, your train's going to just run off the track because the derail's in place. And so typically when you are going to pull the levers to clear the crossing, the first thing you're going to do is remove the derails. So the first lever you're going to pull and remove the derails. The second lever, if there's a switch to be thrown, it's usually going to throw the switch. The last lever is going to drop the signal so the engineer knows he has the clearance. And when you reset the interlocking, goes in reverse order, you're going to pretty much drop the signal or raise the signal back up to stop, align the switch, and then put the derails back in place. And so that was kind of briefly how the interlocking machine worked. And it was there, and like I said, Wallace wasn't very complicated, but they only used like 16 of those 20 levers that they had planned for. And over time, as they, like the derail fell out of service and stuff like that, they got down to where it was just like 4 levers. It's all that you were using by about the 1930s to handle Wallace, Texas. So they pretty much no longer needed a tower operator. They just had basically a telegraph operator to do that job for them. So here's the Tower 51 logbook, and this is again for November the 9th, 1918. This shows all of the trains that went through Wallace, Texas. In the left-hand column is the train number. I realize it's probably isn't all that visible to you, but train number, number 5 up in the SAP was one of their passenger trains, right? It'll have the engine number, then it'll have the time that it went through. If there's 2 time zones, it's the time that it arrived and the time that it left. It went straight through. There's just one time listed on there. And so this particular date, I think the Santa Fe ran 11 trains, although one of them was split into 2 sections. And so, before the days of the nice diesel locomotives we have today, typically steam engines were not double-headed for a great length of time because that wasn't very efficient. You use that for going up hills or for something like that. But if you're going to run a train that's longer than your biggest locomotive can handle, you're going to divide that train into what are called sections. And how do you have all the people on the line realize that these are to be run as one train, even though they're 2 physically separate trains? Well, you put green flags on the boiler or green lights at night, and that tells every operator along the line that if you let the first part of that train come through, you got to let all of the remaining sections come through. You can't split that train up. So they would have these flags and these lights on the boilers, and that would tell them it's a section. And so the Santa Fe actually ran one of their passenger trains at the time. It's called the Ranger, and they ran the Ranger in 2 sections because they basically had more cars than their biggest locomotive was going to pull through there. So the Santa Fe ran like 11 trains. I think the SAF ran like 7 trains. So there were 18 trains for this particular day in a 24-hour period. There's also some notes in the right-hand column. This is where the operators are writing notes, all of the train orders that they issued. The interlocking tower at this time was a train order, became the train order office for the SA&AP, so they were handing orders to the SA&AP train. So even if you've got cleared signal to go through the interlocker, you might still be stopped by the train order signal because he's got orders to hand you, and maybe you have to sign for those orders if they're Form 31s or versus Form 19s. There's also some private Western Union message. It was also a Western Union office, so they would handle Western Union traffic there. If you were a customer, you weren't going to go into the tower though to drop off your Western Union form. That was actually in the passenger depot. There was a little wooden box there with Western Union forms, and you would write your message, hand it to the cashier, and pay in your money, 5 cents a word, or whatever the rate was at the time. And then when he had time, he'd take it over to the tower operation. They would send it on their telegraph lines, and that was another service provided by that. But that, like I said, this book has a lot of good, rich information that I used for the presentation, and I talked about at there. Of all those trains that came through back in 1918, this one still survives today in California. 1899 Baldwin, donated by Santa Fe 953, it's a 280, and it was engine number 664. It was like the first train that came through on the Santa Fe that day, November 9, 1918. I'm sure it came through more times than that, but it was working that part of the Southern District or the Gulf District in Texas at that point in time. It was fine at the time. It was nice to see at least one survivor, because all the rest were long, long gone. So here's some of the train orders. In one part of the book, I did kind of an anatomy where I kind of break down what train orders are, because there's just a lot of people that, these have fallen out of common usage. And so there's a lot of similarities. This is one form for the Santa Fe and one form for the SNAP. This Form 19 on the Santa Fe, one of the big differences is there's no place at the bottom for signatures. Form 19s didn't require signatures. Form 31s, which is on the right-hand side, you see there's a signature at the bottom, and that was proof that the engineer or the conductor of that train had received that order. And so he had to acknowledge that. So you're always going to stop for a Form 31 because you basically have to get that signature. The Form 19 could be handed up by the train order hoop. Back when it was a manual process, where they would put it on those high speeder with the strings on it later on. But these are how the railroads operated away from their schedule. Okay, so if trains are late or trains are delayed and the timetable is no longer valid, then this is how the dispatcher is going to run trains. He's going to tell every pertinent operator, every pertinent train crew what's going to happen here. An example here is the one from the Santa Fe says, number 37, that's the train number. Engine 643 has rights over number 35, engine 641, Wallace to Rosenberg, and hold the main line in Rosenberg. So you tell them, which train has rights and where he's supposed to sit, main line or the side. So that's an example of, an update. These trains were probably supposed to meet somewhere else, but because of the change in time, they're now going to meet, Wallace to meet at Rosenberg. And that's very common to see a lot of train orders. Those were typically Form 19s because they weren't necessarily restricting anything. And so you want a signature for anything that's going to restrict the rights of a train. So if I'm telling this train that he now has to stop somewhere or he has to deviate somewhere, I'm going to make that a Form 31 so I have proof that the train crew receives that order. And so on the right is the SNAP. Now, interesting thing is that I was not able to find out where the numbers 19 and 31 came from. I have no idea why they use those for train orders. Those are the two most common, but really before 1900, you don't really see any Form 19s. Most people at the time didn't think that was a safe practice not to have signatures for the train orders. So Form 19s start to come about after the turn of the century, about 1900, but there's a lot of railroads that think that's not a very safe practice because, again, how do I prove, that the conductor actually received this order, without signatures? So the Santa Fe seems to have kind of, by the time we're, here in 1911, or the Santa Fe seems to have pretty much adopted Form 19s. There's a lot of Form 19s in the pool that I found. SNAP, there's only like one out of a pool of about 60 train orders. It shows you they have not really embraced Form 19s, at 1911. By the time we're at 1918, when I had that tower log, like 80% of the SNAP's train orders were Form 19. So in that 7-year period, they had basically decided, when I got to speed up trains, I can't be stopping for signatures and stuff, times of the evidence, I'm going to start using Form 19s and have everybody adopt the practice. So there's a big change in that. But it tells you a lot about how the railroad was run. Looking at train orders and interoffice messages, and that was the treasure trove that I found, of all places, at the Rosenberg Railroad Museum, where I was the historian for quite a long time, and I'm still an advisor on the board there. A lady back in 2008, I think it was a lady, I don't remember. I remember the executive director showing me this box of papers and looking at them. I remember seeing some train orders, and I knew they were from Wallace, I knew they were from 1911, and I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. It didn't seem like very thick. But if you ever seen a train order, these are little onion skin flimsies. They're very, very thin. So you can have a big pile of these, and not realize how many's really in there because they're so thin. It doesn't look like it's a big pile of paper. And when I was doing this book, I thought, you know, it'd be nice to include some train orders, and I'm just gonna go to Rosenberg, and it may take me 20 minutes, I'll just use my phone and take photographs of them. And I was there 4.5 hours. And I had over 400 interoffice messages and over 100 train orders. And that's when I learned that, see, Wallace was a interchange point where the telegraph lines interchanged between the SANAP and GCSF. So they saw all the traffic go between Galveston and Temple and between Yoakum and Houston. All that traffic went through Wallace. So even messages that weren't about Wallace came through Wallace because the operators were there. And they're gonna take that from the one telegraph line, transmit it down the other telegraph line. So that's when it became a rich repository for so much of how trains operated, you know, in 1911. So that was, I ended up dedicating a whole chapter on just 1911 just to analyze, you know, some of that data. And like I said, I put all of this stuff in the appendix, except for some stuff that was way outside of either the area of Texas or something. There was stuff there that wasn't relevant. The presidents are talking to each other, and it's nothing really relevant. That was the only thing that's, yeah. But about 90% of that I transcribed and put in one of the appendices. Yes. They would both get a copy, the only conductor was required to sign for them. But they still have to, they still have. And those rules change by railroad. Some railroads want an interior to sign too, so you can't say that's a blanket statement across. But for this case, I can tell you for the SAP and the GC, they both only require, at this point in time, the conductor to sign for them. Yeah, he's at the back end, yeah. And the trains weren't as long, that's one thing, near the passenger trains are crazy. It does, it takes time, but if the train has to stop anyway, if they need water, you know, if the steam locomotive, they need fuel, Wallace wasn't a fuel stop on the GC, but it was for the SAP, so you might have other reasons to stop there, but it does, and of course, when things move slower, you know, people aren't as much of a hurry, that 5 minutes or so didn't seem like such a big deal, but when you've got more and more traffic, and your lines getting crowded, and you gotta keep these trains moving, that 5 minutes starts making a lot of difference, and that's why, after 1900, you start seeing the railroads really push for tighter schedules, faster trains, because they've got this volume to, if they're lucky, they got this volume to accommodate, you know, of goods. And I went into the dispatchers, you know, one thing that you learn about dispatching and train stuff, you've heard about OS reports. And I remember having a discussion with a guy about what was the origin of the term OS. Well, that's another thing that nobody seems to know. Mary Meyer, who was an art historian who retired from Southern Pacific, you know, thought it stood for like out of station, you know, because that's basically when the telegrapher was going to notify the dispatcher that this train left the station. I put an example in the book of what the one from the Santa Fe may look like, and you would send the letters OS twice, then the train number, and either D for departure, A for arrival, and then the time. And that's what the dispatcher would write on his sheet. He had a sheet about 3 yards long that he kept every train on his district in, and that's how he managed the thing. And he relied on these OS reports to know where every train on his district was. And if he doesn't hear from an OS report or hear from a train, he's going to ask, you know, find out where it was last was and ask the next operator on the line, where is this train? Have you seen this train? You know, is there a problem? So, you know, dispatching was the engineers called them the delayers, you know, because they were always playing the trains, but I mean, they really had a significant job to do. And these train orders are evidence of a lot of that. Here's some inter-offices messages. There's a train order signal. Early days, it was, I have a picture of it in the book. It's a Santa Fe used what was called, looked like a vein. It was kind of a piece of metal. It's oval shaped and it was painted red. And if that vein was perpendicular to the track where you could see it, then you had to stop. That was your train order signal. If it was parallel to the track and you couldn't really see it, then you had clearance to go. Now, at nighttime, they could put a lamp on there, and the original colors were red for stop and white for proceed. Okay, so if it was showing white, you could go ahead, at least for train order purposes, and red for stop. And this was part of what they called the manual block. There weren't any line side signals that tell you to go and stop, like these roads with no traffic signals. So these block signals, or these manual block signals, also did traffic duty, because in the timetables, all the early railroads said you must maintain a 5-minute minimum distance between trains. So if a train is just left, it's the operator's job to hold the next train and make sure there's at least a 5-minute interval. As time went on, you start seeing line side signals. They take this traffic portion away from the train order signals that were at the depots, and that strictly became a train order function. So by the time Tower 51 is here, you have all of these signals, but as you're approaching the tower, there's an advanced signal, and then there's a signal right before the tower, those are your traffic signals. But the tower themselves, there are these semaphores, those are your train order signals. So I said, you may get to proceed through the interlocker, but then if that train order signal is red, you've got to stop and sign for an order. The SAP only used, later on, that white fell out of favor after about 1900 because it was just too much white light. Before 1900, there wasn't enough white light at night to compete with that, and you couldn't mistake it for a train signal. But after 1900, they decided white is not good anymore for a transportation signal. So that's why they introduced green as proceed, and yellow as caution, and red. That's where our traffic signals came from, pretty much from the railroads. They picked those because they did a lot of color sense testing, also known as color blindness. And many of us are color blind to some degree or another, but it's so slight that we don't notice it. But in the train crews, again, depending on the railroad, if they would test your color vision for red, especially the difference between red and green, and if you couldn't tell the difference between those two, you couldn't be an engineer, you couldn't be a fireman, some you couldn't even be a brakeman, some of them you couldn't even be a conductor. It's been on the railroad. Some were very, very strict about it. Some just said, nah, you can't be an engineer or fireman, but you can be elsewhere on the train. So it all depended on the rules at the time, but that was a key problem there. Here's one of their office messages. This one, even though it's on a Santa Fe message head, it's about the San Antonio Ranches Pass. S.K. Buchanan was the chief dispatcher. That's SKB, that's his initials. Since Wallace, since September the 14th of 1911. Extra 157 broke down at milepost 50. The corner broke off the right front. Side rod is disabled, and the train will have to go to Yoakum. So they basically had the failure of this. And we saw quite a few messages like that. Locomotives, despite best efforts of the crews at the roundhouses, locomotives break down and stuff happens. But we've got lots of good messages. Here's all the people that worked at the depots and in the yards understand what a cars on hand report is. I mean, there's people today that even understand. You have to go out and find out what's all in your yard. But of course, now they're all computerized, right? They have the codes on the side, and a scanner reads it. And so you know pretty much what cars are in your yard because if the computer's right, it's telling you. In the old days, some poor mud hopper had to go out there in all kind of weather and write down every car that was on there. Now that's what these are. The trouble is they're using a cipher, okay? And the railroads use all sorts of cipher. And cipher is basically a code so that it's not obvious what you're talking about, okay? So the president of the railroads would have their own cipher. They had a book, it says you're going to use this code, for your messages, right? Operators had their own cipher. Carmen had their own cipher. Car accountants had their own cipher. The car accountants ones is probably the ciphers that these are, and they're the ones that are the hardest or the most impossible to find. What I can tell you is that these are all different probably types of cars, but it's hard to know exactly. I was never able to find a cipher that would tell me what these are, with one exception. RR at the bottom there of this left one where it says clear, that's the weather. They were also required to report if it was clear, cloudy, rainy, or whatever. And on the right-hand side, the very last one, that hand scratch, you can't read the bottom on the left, is WX. That also means weather. But they were using a code for that, so WX is 11. I don't know if 11 means clear or cloudy or whatever, but that's what they were reporting. But they used the cipher for that. I didn't put these in the book because I was never able to crack the code. I asked a lot of people. There's just not a lot of car accounting codes that survive. But it's one of the great mysteries, and it's something that I'll continue to look for. But WNT on the right was William Newton Tomlinson. He was the agent for the SNAP and later the SP at Wallace for like almost 40 years. So he was at Wallace a long time. But that's one of the things that came along. You can't read this either, but this is census data, and I had to rely on this. So what I used for this book, if you were lucky enough to find employee rosters, which there's just very few of, I happened to find a few. I actually found more for the SNAP than for the Santa Fe, believe it or not. Probably because I was only looking to about 1925 in the SNAP, so there was quite a few. The other thing that happened was that the SNAP, they had a very loyal employee base that had reunions long after the railroad was gone, and they would permeate and make copies of employee rosters to share with people. Well, who was so-and-so that worked over at Yoakum? And they would have a copy of the roster. And so that's why they're more pervasive. You see a lot more copies of SNAP rosters. The Santa Fe had no such that I'm aware of until much later, stuff. And so trying to find rosters for those. And when you go to research firms and ask them what are employee rosters, we talked about this last night at the dinner. You can go to a lot of these archives stuff, they have no idea what you're talking about. I asked the archives in Kansas, do you have employee rosters? They had no idea. And they don't have time to find out. So, you literally have to go there and dig this up if you want to find anything about employees. I was lucky to find stuff from the Santa Fe, so this leaves you with census data. This was my first time to try to use census data, and let me tell you, the genealogy people already know this because they've done through this a lot. But census data is a whole other animal. For one thing, you're at the mercy of the census every 10 years. You're at the mercy of how good the penmanship is of the person taking the census. And I was lucky for most of these, I was able to read most of it. There were a couple that were really challenging. Number two is like this one, they did write, Wallace on this one, but for a couple of them, they just wrote Precinct 8, Austin County. And I didn't know Precinct 8, Austin County was Wallace, Texas, but I had to learn that because, so when you're doing searches, that's the most aggravating thing about census data. You might search for Wallace, Texas, and you only get these hits. You're like, well, why don't I have, the 1910 census? Well, because they didn't write Wallace on the page there. Whoever was taking the census just wrote Precinct 8, Austin County. So it became a great source for finding employee stuff. The other thing is, like I said, they do not identify the railroad. So you have to kind of use the cross-reference or cross-elimination to figure out which railroad the guys work for here. But it's it was time worth it, and I'm glad, because that's another thing that people, when they come to our museums, always ask us. My grandfather worked for so-and-so. Do you have any record of it? And most time we don't, because this is about the only place you're gonna find it unless you have an employee roster. But a lot of your genealogy people are always looking for railroad stuff. So part of the reason I put an appendix in the back of the book for this was because I think people would want to know, especially because railroad men were transitory. A lot of the people didn't live in Walsh for a long time. Tomlinson was a big exception, living there all his life and being a railroad man there. But most of them, especially your maintenance away guys and your other guys were 3 to 4 years. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Going back to the Dallas record.
Yeah. Yes.
Point,
Yeah.
they can say, this was the plan,
Right.
so we work for it and then work at it.
Yeah, in the big cities, that was good. You would have directories, In Wallace and Eagle Lake, we don't have those, But that's a good source, like I said, for the larger towns. So again, I told you I covered the 1913 flood. It really hit the SNAP really hard because of the territory that they covered. The floodwaters hit. Their line up to Waco was served in several places. Their line east of Wallace to Houston was pretty much every trestle was demolished by the 13 flood. It is still the flood of record for much of the Colorado and Brazos River basins in southeast Texas. That's how bad the 13 flood was. And it was in December. The interesting thing, now this is what you're looking at here is in the middle, the taller structure is a bridge that was built just 3 years prior, and that's the new SNAP bridge over the Colorado River in Altair, Texas, which is about 6 miles west of Eagle Lake. To the left of that is actually a railroad bridge, but that's the one the county had bought for them, used for the highway bridge. And it dated to about 1887. So you notice that the bridges themselves still stand, but the approaches are pretty much gone. There were some workers that were stranded here, up on the rail part, and I put some articles from the newspaper in there about the SNAP actually built boats to go and rescue these guys, from there, and they had to row against, quote, a very strong current to get them back, to safety. So the SAP built boats for that. But yeah, it took them a long time. It took them months to get back. They weren't back to normal, for almost 6 to 8 weeks on the line, especially between Wallace and Houston. There was a big gap there where the Colorado River was, and so they would run, because of the mail contracts, they still had to run passenger trains, even though they couldn't go all the way from Yoakum to Houston. So they would run from Yoakum, to the west side of Altair, and they would run a train from Houston to about Wallace, and then there was a gap in between there where there was no train service for a time until they built the bridges. But the financial effects from that really hurt. It hurt both railroads, but again, the Santa Fe, the GCNS is part of the Santa Fe system, so they have a big parent company, a lot of money. SNAP is kind of, even though they're sort of pseudo-affiliated with the SP at this time, they're kind of like that stepchild, and not treated very well, and so it really hurt them bad. So there was some interesting reroutes though. The SP rerouted for a couple of days the Sunset Limited through Wallace. And I have a picture of the Sunset Limited, not through Wallace, but the newspaper report showed some interesting routing that happened during the flood. Another topic covers the Great War, probably the most talked about topic in railroading, no matter which railroad you talk about. And there's a lot of misunderstanding. Number one misunderstanding is the government took control of the railroads, and that is patently false. The government was asked to take control of the railroads because the railroad board that had been founded for this purpose realized there were problems they could not solve. What you have up leading to the Great War is a period of economic, slowness, which means railroads tend to defer things. They defer car maintenance, they defer track maintenance, they defer buying new equipment. And so, about the time in 1914, I mean, our traffic starts picking up even though we're not in the war because we're selling to both sides. Until the English blockade, ropes off Germany, we're selling to both sides. And so there's a lot of train traffic at a time our railroads aren't able to handle it. And a couple of the big problems were, how do I have all these railroads, there's like 53 class 1 railroads at the time. How do I get them to function as one railroad? Really hard to do, right? One of the things you have to do is kind of like what they call pooling. Now, pooling was abused by Jay Gould and many other railroad magnates in the 1800s. And it basically was a way to, even though I have competition through a particular territory, we collude so that we all get to kind of the same rate. There's no real break in the price, right? So not only did the Railroad Commission of Texas outlaw it, but basically the Interstate Commerce Commission outlawed it as well. But unfortunately, during something like this, where you want to try to all to work as one, pooling was actually a good thing. But the Attorney General of the United States would not, he would not overlook that law. They basically asked him, would you overlook this law so we can achieve this? And he said, no, I'm not going to do it to. So at the point where they started to fail, that's when they asked the president to take over. And he knew it was coming. I mean, he said they did the best job they could, but there are some things that the railroads themselves could not solve. So the government took them over. On a more local level, there weren't, even though under the United States Railroad Administration, when that was formed, through Wallace, there weren't a lot of traffic changes actually during the war, but like a week after the war, the USRA did some real crazy routing, and they route one of the passenger trains that used to go through Wallace from Houston directly to Sealy over the Missouri, Kansas, Texas lines, and it didn't stop at any station in between there. It was kind of like you were talking in the middle of the cutoff, that they were run something, they think they were just experienced, but why did they wait till after the war? What they kind of did was they stranded Wallace, and they no longer had access to Galveston without going to Sealy, and so people are complaining like, we went through the war's over, what's this routing for? And it took them like a year to kind of fix that sort of stuff, but the URSA did some really nutty stuff in the last year of its existence. The good news about that, though, is that the URSA, from the day they founded that, it was not meant to be permanent. The government said that we don't want to be in the railroad business. We want this to go back, to the thing. But the change that was made was that everybody, except probably the customers, wanted fewer railroads and larger railroads because it was easier for them to manipulate. And so railroads at this point, before World War I, railroads were still kind of an independent company, profit-based, serve the customer base. After World War I, they've become more like a controlled monopoly. They're more like an electric utility. And that was the pervasive, the government wanted that, the railroad executives wanted that, everybody except the customers wanted that. And you'll see that big change between pre-World War I and post-World War I. It made a big difference in the railroad industry. So I have a few charts that I put in the book. One is about we always talk about passenger traffic. During the war, passenger traffic actually increased, and it wasn't strictly military. A lot of it was, just people having to go and do things. And of course, again, the GCNSF is there in blue, and they're part of the big Santa Fe system, so it's no surprise that their traffic is much, much higher than the little SANAP, which is truly a regional railroad, right? And so, but notice that 1919, 1920 is kind of the peak in both railroads. And what that is all these soldiers coming back from overseas. This is what they call the, disembarkation, where they're coming back from overseas. The embarkation is when they're leaving to go overseas. And that helped spike, the railroad passenger. It took them almost a year. And of course, a lot of them they staged over there. There was occupation forces in Germany and such, so some of the people stayed there a long time. But it's mostly because they didn't have the ships and the trains to get them all back home, at one time. And they were talking about millions and millions of people. So they did a pretty able job. But as expected, the SAP actually reported in 1914 that they were already seeing the impact of automobiles. And remember, they serve mostly rural areas. But which kind of surprised you. You think they're going to see that in the city first, but they're actually saying that they're seeing loss of passenger traffic to automobiles as early as 1914. That's the first one I see in their annual reports. Supposedly, I didn't verify this, supposedly the first automobile in Texas was ordered in 1898 from the Sears Roebuck catalog from a guy in Temple. Okay. What I can tell you from newspaper reports is pretty much by 1909, to the point you guys were making about newspapers and about stuff they printed there. Dr. So-and-so has the first automobile in town. You start to see all these reports, just a little byline in the newspaper, and you start seeing that over and over again. And it starts becoming, an issue. In fact, such an issue. Now, one of the neat things about Texas Railroad Commissions, they captured a lot of data. The bad news is that just when you get ready to one format, they follow for like 5 years, then they change it. And you gotta try to interpolate that to make a graph like this go over like, 20, almost 20 years, because they change format so much. But this is total designated railroad crossings in Texas, and it really starts becoming a problem. You can see, about 1912, especially the fatalities, 1912, 1913, there's a drop in 1915, but then it really starts going up, and they're trying to address this issue. Now, obviously, in the earlier years, these aren't all strictly from automobiles, but part of the issue is before 1917, the reports didn't say what was involved besides the train at these accidents, we'll call it, okay? So it's not until 1970 they decide what sort of conveyance was it. Was it a horse and buggy? And was it a wagon? Was it an automobile? So you don't really have the impact of how much automobiles really affect this before 1917, but clearly it's a problem after 1917, and everybody's concerned about it. And this isn't just in Texas, this is nationwide, as you have roads that are starting to be built. But what you start seeing after 1909 is these county commissioners' courts become, run with people saying, well, we want to build these roads. We want to build these roads and highways. And there was no, the counties are actually responsible at that time for roads in Texas. There was no state highway commission or anything like that. So the counties are starting to build roads. And that's why the early roads you see kind of go this way and that way as somebody would allow for stuff through their property. So this became such an issue that as it was called then, the American Railway Association had a crossing safety campaign. And this is just some of their, starting in 1922 was the first year. That one on the left was an actual fatality in Texas near Beaumont. But I mean, they started this and they would put these out every year, and all the railroads were expected to take part and put these posters out and try to get people to be more cautious of that. It's hard to tell the impact of this, because you don't see, as we saw in the previous slide, you don't really see a decrease in fatalities or accidents. And part of the problem is because Texas mileage grew up until the 1920s, okay? So Texas railway mileage is growing, Texas highway mileage is growing, the number of cars is growing. So you can't really measure the impact of something like this when you have so much growth and so many more opportunities for people to get hurt or killed. But it's still, some of these posters are pretty interesting. I found, actually at Eagle Lake Depot, I found, it's not one of these, but one of the posters that it was put up in 1925 was still on one of the old bulletin boards in there. And it was part of it. So they would put that on the public bulletin board in the waiting room to remind people that, if you're in an automobile, safety first. So here's a few then and now pictures to kind of finish up. On the left is the earliest photograph taken in Wallace, Texas. That's June the 28th, 1887. And that is looking towards, the little building in the background is the Gulf, Colorado and Santa Fe Depot in Wallace. There's a flat car here, Lincoln Pincucker. There's some men on your right, and what you can see where those men are standing, that's the transfer track from the SNAP this is facing southbound looking towards Rosenberg and Galveston. That's the transfer track that they're building from the SNAP to connect with the Gulf, Colorado and Santa Fe. Probably behind the photographer is the actual crossing of those two railroads. This gem of a photograph was actually in the archives at Temple, Texas, but they didn't really know or weren't sure that's what it was. And so after a lot of research, and actually the photograph was reversed. It wasn't until I reversed the photograph. But you may be able to see on the left side of the depot there, the cistern I was telling you about. It's kind of got a little cone-shaped top on it and everything, but that's where they captured the water. There's no water tank yet, so obviously this is before 1889 when the water tank was there, but that's the photograph. And on the right is what that looks like today, looking southbound on the BNSF. Quite a changing scene. My other one here is now the picture I started off with the interlocking tower, the Wells Fargo building, and then the Union Depot, and it would have crossed the Santa Fe. That's the BNSF line you can see on the rail there, but it would have gone straight across the course. There's some oil storage tanks and stuff in the background there, going towards the west, towards Eagle Lake. So like when you drive through Wallace today, it's hard to imagine all these things were there, but it was a wonderful case study in the history. And so for my sources, basically annual reports from both the railroads. That was easier for the SNAP because they were independent. The trouble with the early days of the railroad, the annual reports, when they're smaller, the annual reports carry out kind of wonderful data in them, like what was shipped by the railroad. Because if you don't see an annual report, you have to find waybills, and most of those waybills don't survive, so it's hard to get a picture. But in the early reports, once the GCNF was acquired by the Santa Fe, they didn't want to see all that nice, rich data, at least not in the annual report. So you can't find that in their stockholder reports, but you can find those in the SNAP all the way up to 1925. So I found those employee magazines. The SAP didn't have any, but there's a lot of Santa Fe employee magazines that are available online. And so newspaper articles, of course, census data, as I mentioned, employee rosters. For a lot of the rules and regulations, I went straight to the rule books, and the early employee timetables would have rules published in them. And it's interesting, some things that I didn't know is that, I was telling you about when trains were pushed in sections and divided up, green flags are on the boiler or green lights. Before they were required by the Santa Fe, the bill for how to use red flags and red lights, which seems kind of weird to us today, but that was part of the standard. So as this would happen, they would move forward. But I put a list at the end of my book of where all the stuff came from. So with that, I'll wrap it up unless there's any questions.
Did you say something real quick about SAP's plans to build a hospital?
SAP's plans to build Austin, yes. So they made it as far as Lockhart. They were gonna move all of Austin, and I do actually have the right-of-way map where they plan to build onto Austin. And that sort of kind of just fell by the wayside, after they realized, number one, Austin wasn't gonna be a town that had a lot of traffic, and they had had too many other issues, including their bankruptcy and the other things that happened to them after a big wreck in 1890. And so Lockhart wasn't intended to the terminus road, that became the terminus of the road, just for that reason. But it was, and for a while, the other timetables, it is called the Austin Branch. But that disappears pretty much, I think, by about 1890 to 1893, they're pretty much just called that the Lockhart Branch. That's the question, Mike?
Yeah. What was the cause of the 1913 flood? Was it a hurricane or?
No, they don't say, but my guess is because this is in December. You've heard of a cutoff low, a low pressure system that just doesn't have any steering current. It's not like a tropical storm. It has all the moisture, but not the wind. And it'll sit there and it'll spin, and it'll generate moisture and generate moisture and generate moisture. And I haven't seen anybody really prove this, but I think it was what's called a cutoff low. And usually by that time of year, there's a frontal boundary to push lows, one way or the other. There's no high pressure and low pressure. But my suspicion is that's what it was, because I've seen that happen before, where it just dumps, in 24 hours, it can dump a lot of rain. And this is only just a couple-day event, but it dumped a lot of rain in the upper watersheds of the Colorado and the Nebraska rivers. Yeah, good question. They actually did meet somewhere probably east of I-10, or south of I-10, yeah. Not sure the exact point, but there was I know by the time you get to like west of Rosenberg to East Menard and Walsall, that was, there were flood waters were all together at that point. Yeah, because the little San Bernard River runs through there, and so, the Colorado, the Brazos, and the San Bernard, waters all commingled, but that has not happened, since then, thankfully.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I have the distinction of being probably the only person in this room who's ever gotten their car stuck within the interlocking limits of water.
I'm not totally shocked about that.
And some local residents got $5 to pull me out.
Good for you. Okay. All right, thank you very much, appreciate it.
All right, tell you what, we had one other program scheduled for the morning, but, I'm told that they are ready next door over here with our lunch, so if anybody's hungry, you might just go ahead and take your, lunch break now, do lunch, and then when we're done, then we'll come back and get up and move on. That suits everyone. Out the door to the right, and the traditions room, at the end, will be our lunch. And, I did a count, we got lunch for everybody, so if you do RSVP, don't worry about it, don't come there.